Happy New Year! I'm Beth. Welcome back. It is time for our wrap-up of 2024, how my goals went for last year's reading. Make sure to drop in the comments any goals you've set for this year. I love getting ideas from all of you, not just with what books to read next, but also reading goals and habits that can help all of us be better readers in 2025. First off, some overall stats. Once again, data is coming from the Storygraph app. So here we go. I read a total of 135 books in 2024. My average rating was 3.71 stars. I read a total of 52,884 pages. I am going to give credit to Leo Tolstoy for this because I read War and Peace last year. As far as page length goes, 15% of the books I read were more than 500 pages, 29% were less than 300, and 56% were between the 300 and 499 page counts. The average amount of time it takes me to read a book is 6 days. I had some pretty big books last year that took me a little bit longer to complete, and because I usually have more than one going at a time, this makes sense to me and I'm not disappointed by it in the slightest. September was my highest reading month in 2024 with 19 books. I read the least books in July, which makes complete sense because I was reading War and Peace. I mostly read physical books because I dislike looking at a screen after working on one all day, but I read 4 books as audiobooks or as like a hybrid in tandem with a physical copy, and I read 1 book from NetGalley entirely on my phone and hated it. Prevalent moods in the books I was reading were also pretty matchy with last year, except you can see that mysterious traded places with adventurous, and funny got downgraded. Slightly more serious books this past year. Books that I enjoy reading are still within the mysterious and adventurous categories. My top 5 genres were fantasy, no surprise there at 47 books, mystery, 31 books, romance, 29 books, and thriller, 22 books. Literary fiction is tied with contemporary fiction at 21 books. Storygraph categorizes books into multiple genres, so we have a few books that are overlapping. On to the personal goals. My first goal of last year was to stay classy, and that was simply to read more classic books. I ended up reading 12 books that are categorized as classics. Here are the 5 stars. The Blue Castle by L.M. Montgomery. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. This one was a reread. I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith. Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. And Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Interestingly, those top 5 all center around a coming-of-age protagonist, so that might be a trend that I need to lean into to find some more favorite books this year. The other classics I read were The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim, Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, Appointment with Death by Agatha Christie, We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, Evil Under the Sun by Agatha Christie, and War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. My second goal of the year was to streak series, and in addition to reading the next volume of a lot of series that are still ongoing, I also streaked through a couple. The Seven Waters trilogy by Juliette Marillier, which is technically part of a larger series at this point in time, but those initial 3 are also a trilogy unto themselves. So I read Daughter of the Forest, Son of Shadows, and Child of the Prophecy, and I pretty much wrapped that series up by the end of the year. There was a little bit of overlap into January with that 3rd and final book, but I'm counting that as one of the series that I finished in the year. I enjoyed actually making progress and finishing a specific series, and that series was The Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb. That was my 3rd goal, to conquer the realm, and I smashed it. Very happy to have read this epic fantasy series. I am more than willing to reminisce, to agonize with you, and to talk about the major points of Robin Hobb's storytelling, which is masterful. So let me know if you want to have a conversation about it at any time, because I am raring to go, having finished the entire Realm of the Elderlings. My fourth goal was real world, which was to read more nonfiction. This one I'm gonna go ahead and call a fail, because I only read 12 books that were nonfiction last year. It's 9% versus 91%. However, I don't care. I really don't care about getting that goal. That's not one that I plan to reset for this year. I just don't find I get as much out of nonfiction as I do out of fiction. It's not the reason that I read. I don't really read to get information. I read to experience things that I don't in my present life. Even though I didn't read very many nonfiction last year, I would say my most enjoyable ones were in the memoir category. When I do pick up nonfiction this year, I'm thinking through what biographies, what memoirs can I add to my TBR intentionally so that I am benefiting from nonfiction, focus on the nonfiction that doesn't bore me, and also lean into audiobooks, because that's the format that I find most digestible for nonfiction. My fifth goal was more library hauls. 49 of the books that I read last year were borrowed from the library. 36 were already owned and on my bookshelf. 31 were books that I bought and resold on Pango Books. 19 were new buys. I'm really happy with the way that these break down. I will continue to use my local library as my primary resource for books. Even though I like the idea of prioritizing the books that I already own, oftentimes I am borrowing newer books in the library as I'm hearing them talked about or as they're being released. So it's a good balance, and I'm happy with where these shake out as well. I also made a custom TBR of 24 books to read in 2024. Here are the results of that priority TBR. I read 22 of them. I had this giant pile of books that I started with in my video last year, and I just worked my way through based on what I was in the mood to read. So in January, I read Fool's Fate by Robin Hobb, I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith, The Illumination of Ursula Flight, and Dragon Haven by Robin Hobb. Of those books, I kept 3 and I sold The Illumination of Ursula Flight because while it was a very beautifully designed book, I didn't particularly love the story. In February, I read City of Dragons by Robin Hobb, as well as I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman, and The Other Bennett Sister by Janice Hadlow. Of those February reads, I kept 2 and I sold 1. I got rid of I Who Have Never Known Men. In March, I read Stardust by Neil Gaiman, and that is another book that I resold. In April, I read Fool's Assassin and Fool's Quest, both by Robin Hobb, and A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith, which was a reread for me of a favorite book. Loved it just as much, if not more, than the first time I read it. In May, I read Assassin's Fate and Know My Name by Chanel Miller. In June, I read Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. July through August, I read War and Peace. And at the end of August, I read The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. In September, I read The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. This was a book where the writing style was very unique, but the story was feeling violent, and I didn't like some of the themes that were being focused on in the story, so I ended up DNFing this one. In November, I read The Angel's Game by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. October wasn't included here because I took a little bit of a break from my TBR and did a lot of mood reading in October. In December, I read Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, Lobster Life by Eric Fosnes Hansen, and I tried to read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. I tried and failed. I had to DNF this one. The way the story was being told was distracting me from the plot of it all, and I couldn't get into it. The only book that I didn't get to on those 24 books was Mrs. Dalloway, and that was purely because I put it off to the very end and I didn't feel like reading it at the time. I don't think I'm gonna add it to a priority TBR for this year. It might just be one of those where I feel like like I'm up for the challenge and I finally decide to read it. Here are my thoughts on having a priority TBR. I have a more creative idea for how to approach that this year that I'm really excited to share with you. If this is something that you are setting up for yourself for this year, try not to have too many of them be books that you feel like you need to read. Limit it to maybe 3 at the max that feel necessary, and make the rest of them books that you are literally chomping at the bit to read. As far as those hefty classics that you've been meaning to get to, unless that's really your thing, maybe don't use too many of those on that priority TBR. So that's the numbers for how my reading went in 2024, and hear about my reading goals for 2025. Just sit tight and that will play for you next. Thanks for watching.